Welcome back, everyone. The second lecture of the course is on the flux aesthetics, which is about glaze surface and what I call the unifying surface and the drip. We'll be looking at glazes and glaze surfaces, looking at the history and the various approaches to glaze surfaces, but there will be an emphasis on the drip because I believe it is a very specific characteristic of ceramic surfaces, the fluxy, liquid, moving, drippy surface of glazes. In the first lecture, we were focusing mostly on the constancy of form in various ceramic traditions. Now we're going to be looking at surfaces a bit more and looking at glazes. So let's start with the history of glazes and the earliest glazes. The earliest glazes are found in Mesopotamia around 3000 BC, so more or less 5,000 years ago. And Mesopotamia is this part of the world where Iran, Iraq, the Middle East to a large degree is located. And Mesopotamia is very important in the history of ceramics because not only do we have the first glazes there, we also have the first wheel work, the first kilns. A lot of new technologies were first invented and developed in the Middle East. We'll look at the importance of new technologies and a variety of new developments in terms of the technology of ceramics in Asia as well. But Mesopotamia is a very important part of the story. So those objects that we see here were funerary in purposes. They were offering in tombs, which protected them to a large degree. They're very small little boxes. And you may notice, because we will look into both abstraction and decoration a bit later on in a further lecture, and also representation, like the piece on the right, which has the outlook of a figure falling back as it's being covered by it's being transperced by a spear or a sword, so it's dying. So the relationship of ceramics and death is also something we will look in one of the themes later on. But I want to start introducing a variety of aesthetics and a variety of themes like funerary purposes right away. So I'm showing you a few examples of Ziwoye Mesopotamian early glazes because of the beauty of those objects and the quality of the glazes and the nature of the images on them and combinations of representations and abstract motif and the symbolism of all of those things, which again we will look at a bit later. But I wanted you to be introduced to those amazing objects that are 5,000 years old, that have already right away very early on in the development of glazes a beautiful use of the material and its potential for both aesthetic pleasure and symbolic meaning. And what's interesting about glazes is that although they go back that much time, they keep being forgotten and then they reappear in another place. And it has a very spotty history where it happens and it dies and it happens again and it disappears and it's forgotten. And so that's quite interesting in itself, So 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, people were glazing things, and then for quite a while there was no glazing on ceramic objects. They went back to clay surfaces, and then it was rediscovered a bit later on, and it happened like this more or less in various parts of the world. For example, we have some example from Jericho, which is in Palestine. And from so again, this would have been a rediscovery through contact with Egypt, where in the western part of the Middle East, glazes closer to us 3,000 years ago, a bit more, were again more or less rediscovered. And same thing in Egypt. Those things happen more or less independently. I mean, those cultures were in contact with one another. They traded, they conquered one another. There was a lot of exchange in all kinds of ways. But it's difficult to assess, exactly who did what first and whether things were learned from a neighbor or invented independently. But this is the interior of a tomb of the Saqqara pyramid in Egypt, and it's completely lined with what we call Egyptian paste, which is a self-glazing clay body, where the clay body contains a form of salt and some pigments as well. And when the clay dries, the salt navigates to the surface and then melts when the piece is fired in a kiln and creates a natural glaze. So the object doesn't receive a coat of glaze. The glaze is in the body and develops in the drying and firing process of the wear. And this was the earliest approach to glazing in Egypt. The Egyptians were also the first to invent glass technology, glass blowing and making things out of glass, and of course glass, as well as various metal technology like smelting and casting bronze and so on. All of those things are more or less invented at the same time and related to one another. But the work is of great beauty, great sophistication. Egyptian paste is very non-plastic as a material because of the presence of the salt, so it's often press molded in clay molds, and sometimes you get multiples for that reasons because the objects could be made in a variety of forms. They tend to be this beautiful turquoise blue for the presence of copper in the clay body, or a deep blue for the presence of cobalt. One of my favorite things made with Egyptian paste are those beads that were made into dresses and covering, either for living bodies or for mummies. The people, mummies were covered with jewelry and buried with those wonderful things. So this is just a detail of the beads. So that again, it's the principle of Egyptian paste, a self-glazing body, the two colors of turquoise and deep blue, and then reassembled into nets or coverings or jewelry. This is an example here of a complete dress. Of course, when that object was found, the thread connecting the beads had disappeared. So the beads were found in disassembled state, but the archaeologists reconstructed the dress due to the position of the elements in the soil. Just to bring up again this idea that ceramics is a very permanent material, it's very resistant to time, it survives millennial no matter what the conditions. And most of the material we'll be looking at in this course is of this nature, like it's an archive, it's been preserved. Most of it has been funerary in origins, and this is why we have those things. The object on the lower right is a ring, so it's a very small object. And then various elements of the jewelry were often made with insertion of Egyptian paste. So I'm showing you a few examples of Egyptian ceramics because it's very, very beautiful and very original and very, very early in the history of ceramic itself. And you can see here from the example from Egypt, very ancient Egypt, on the left, and a contemporary version of the same aesthetic approach of a dark image over a light blue vivid ground by an American potter called Victor Schreckengost from the 1930s. So there is always this dialogue and this relationship between the past and the present and the very antiquity with contemporary needs and issues to be developed in ceramics. And then here I have an example from China, which again is much later. One is basically 1000 BC, and this is 1300 after the Common Era. But you can see that again, it's black and blue as two colors to generate a very beautiful and optical dynamic relationship between the two. So those relationships are found again at different times in different locations all over the world. And then there is some glazing, or what they call faience in archaeology, in Crete as well. In the Minoan time, you have small figures that have a glazed surface and small plaques as well that show us the houses and buildings of the time, something we will look at much more closely in the shelter team lecture later on. But it's a very similar principle than Egyptian paste, with the salt embedded in the clay that sort of fuses on the surface of the object as it is fired. And then we move on to, later on, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, again in the Middle East, where things develop further in terms of glazes are mixed independently as a liquid. They're applied by dipping and pouring and various application methods that are then fired at a variety of temperature. Alkaline glazes are very low temperature glazes, but there is more and more and more sophistication coming in field and the possibility. We're going back a little bit in time here with the Ishtar gates from around 575 BC. Again, this is a piece that is now in a museum in Berlin, but it was originally dug in a site in Iraq and brought to Germany by the archaeologists, and they're glazed bricks. And this is basically the rediscovery of glazes in the Middle East after the earliest Ziwiye funerary offerings of 2,000 years before. So for a long period of time, glazes were more or less forgotten for a variety of reasons. And around 600 BC in Mesopotamia, again in Babylonia, glazed tiles appear. And then we don't have any glazes in the Greek and Roman world really to speak of for many, many centuries. But some objects of Greek ceramics have surfaces that are reminiscent of glazes. And I still have to discover whether the Greeks were working with the idea of glazes, whether it played a role. Because, those cultures were in connections with Persia, they were in connection with Egypt, there was a lot of exchange again. And although glazes are not part of the aesthetic of Greek Attic pottery, the black color on Greek Attic pottery, as we see on this object, is not a glaze. It's a highly smooth and vitrified clay that, through burnishing, gets this shiny surface. So let's have a look at Oriental glazes from Asia, because they are also quite exciting and quite interesting and tremendously influential in the development of glazed surfaces worldwide, especially in the 20th century, through the leech aesthetics and other traditions. So the difference between glazes in Asia and glazes in the Middle East in terms of their development is that the Middle East, the clay is mostly earthenware clay, and they have access to the resources of salt deposits and so on. So the materials and the geography and the technologies are more appropriate for low temperature glazes. Well, in Asia, stoneware clays to make pots are very, very common. And so they could also build kilns with stoneware material that could be fired at much higher temperature than the kilns could be fired at in the Mesopotamia and the Middle East and that part of the world. So what happens is that they would put stoneware objects unglazed within a kiln that was itself built with stoneware clay, so that they could be fired at quite high temperatures. And the kilns are fired with wood, and in the process of firing, the wood generates ashes which go into the kiln and deposit on the stoneware form and melt as a natural glaze over the surface of the form and the clay stoneware. So very quickly, the people realized that a natural glaze that was beautiful and changed the aesthetic quality of the object, and also sealed it and make it less porous, and all of those things are very great advantages. So what we're looking at here from Japan is again an early ashwood-fired stoneware piece, where the glaze you see, all those surfaces are simply ash deposit coming from the process of firing with wood to create the glazed surface. But very quickly people realized that if you mixed clay and ashes together with water, you would get something you could then apply with a brush by dipping, by pouring over the surface and control the location of the glaze and its quality and its application and so on. And this is basically how glazes were developed in Asia, most notably in China and then other Asian countries. And a broad variety of glazes were developed over, a few thousand years, basically, because this is a process that's still ongoing. But it is very possible to say that, the variety and richness of possibilities of glazes in ceramics are found mostly coming from Asia and from China as the main source for this extraordinary development in the field. And I'm showing you here some example of, glazes used, the way they recess over a trail line for domestic wear, or oil spud glazes, which have beautiful crystalline surface coming from very, very, very slow firings and very, very slow coolings. And those objects, although it's just a small T-ball, can be extremely valuable now on the art market and so on. But the quality of the work comes from the material used, their composition, their application, but also the very slow firing that takes place over 2, 3, 4, 5 days sometimes. And then the very, very slow cooling of those huge kilns. The kilns would be very huge and fire thousands of pots at once. The cooling itself could last up to a week. And in the process of slow firing and slow cooling, extraordinarily rich surface would develop, and so on. And one thing that's interesting is that it's considered auspicious if the drip doesn't reach the base, as this adds to the value of the objects. So sometimes the glaze would run and drip and stick to the foot of the wear, and that's perceived as not so auspicious. Well, if the drip is just collecting at the bottom of the glaze surface and stays there, it's seen as an auspicious sign, and it adds to the aesthetic experience of the work. So I'm showing you again two more examples, contemporary example of oil spud glazes, because those glazes are still used today and they're still current in many ways. So I want to talk a little bit more about the drip, because the drip is a very important characteristic of ceramic glazes and a very important and essential contribution of ceramics to the world of visual experience. And here we have ill jars from China, from the Han Dynasty mostly, which is around the time of Christ in terms of a chronology. And what's interesting about those ill jar is that you can see on the upper right here that the lid was fired upside down within the jar, so that the second jar could be put on top. They could be stacked in the kiln and save space. But in that process, the drip of the glaze collected at the top of the mountain peaks and added to their elevation and a spirit of connection with the heaven and a spiritual quality. And then the light shines through those drips, and it creates some things very beautiful. So something done for saving space, for practicality, for ease of working, also adds to the beauty of the object. And that's something I wanted you to be aware of. Like even the jar on the right, if you look at the directions of the drips, they go from the bottom up because the piece was fired upside down and the drips are collecting at the rim on top. And all of this makes the form sort of lift from the ground and gives it elevation again. And those things were done for very practical reasons, but it does, by the potter, by being aware of what happened in the kiln as the glaze melts and moves and runs and collects, it changes the quality of surface, it modifies the form, and all of those things make the work way more sophisticated and way more powerful than it would be otherwise. And here I have an example by an American contemporary Nancy Selvin, who fires her little bowl upside down, again over a support, so that the drips collect at the surface, and which makes you aware of the fact that the bowl may contain a liquid, and that liquid could be exited through the edge of the form. And if it is a glaze and it's in a kiln, it will fuse and stay there and be sort of fixed, almost like a photograph. But if it was water or tea, it would then be consumed. So it brings in the notion of function through representation in ways that's quite sophisticated. Now let's look at Tang China Sanchai three-color glazes, because they're among my favorite glaze wares in the history of ceramics and some of the most exciting. They are low temperature glazes, although the Chinese were the first to discover high temperature stoneware and then porcelain glazes. They were also doing low temperature glazes, mostly for funerary purposes, because those glazes are made with lead, so they are highly toxic, and it's a good thing that they were used not for domestic reasons, for the use of people in daily life, but for offerings in tomb. And here you have an example of three vases made at the time of the Tang Dynasty, one in earthenware, one in bronze, and one in stoneware on the right. Same form, different material, different glazes, different firing temperature. And the Tang are also very celebrated for their horses. So the Tang Dynasty is around the 8th century of our era. And those horses are really exquisite. We will look at them again when we look at figuration in ceramics later on. But I'm showing you a few examples here of how glaze and the surface of the coloration and the quality of the material is making those sculptural ceramic horses so amazingly beautiful and exquisite and sophisticated. This is another example here, and you can see how the glaze is not imitating fur or is not meant to describe specifically anything related to what is represented, but it still retains a specifically ceramic quality and ceramic surface behavior. And it creates a relation. One associates what we see with fur and the skin of a horse, but it is not imitative or trying to make you believe it is the real thing. And I think this is what makes it so potent. This is a contemporary reproduction that maybe goes a little bit too far. And if you look at the image and think about it, you will figure out in what position it was in the kiln to create those striations as a diagonal. And so very often objects will be positioned and fired in a kiln in a situation and in a direction that is not logical, but will create a final effect of great interest. So I'm showing you quite an extensive selection of Tang wares because, as I said earlier, they're some of my favorite in terms of the richness of the surface and the connections with the form and the beauty of the two of them. And one thing I really like about Tang ceramics with Sanchai glazes is that because the glazes are so runny, the bottom of the ware is very rarely glazed. And when the glaze melts and runs into the kiln, it creates this beautiful natural sort of almost landscape line and a very strong contrast between the rawness and dryness of the base with the shininess and vibrancy of the color of the glaze above. And the contrast of the two I find very resolved and very dynamic and very pleasing. And the way the colors run into one another and move together and the way it blurs a little bit, that's something quite geometric and becomes almost organic and very the messiness is always pleasing. It's always quite beautiful. And the inventions of pattern and surface, which is again something we will look at later when we look at decoration and patterning in ceramics. But those objects were made in vast quantities. They were funerary offerings, again, for the needs of the deceased after death. And they're really amazing. They were not really meant to be functional, although they may have contained food and things for the needs of the deceased. But right now, they are appreciated basically for their extraordinarily beautiful aesthetic presence and the relationship of color. And you have to keep in mind the color are very limited. Sunshine means three colors, so it's basically a yellow, a green, and a brown coming together. The blue is quite rare. I'm showing you quite a few examples with blue because it adds more to the richness of the things, but it's basically brown, yellow, and green that are the three basic colors found more commonly. And again, looking at how the glaze behaves over the form, how they respond to one another, how they drip and move and then are arrested and collected and stopped and fixed by the cooling of the kiln, and how it makes everything very dynamic and speaks of process, speaks of time, speaks of change, and speaks of change that stopped and is not going to change anymore. You can have this really strong feeling that at some point there was something very dynamic going on and now it has been arrested and it will be like this for millenniums more. And on the right, a piece by Mineo Mizuno from 1983, where he again reinvestigate a very ancient Chinese form in the context of contemporary ceramics. So Sanchai have been very influential. And in the contemporary world, you have somebody like Betty Woodman using those three colors. And the process of application and firing and the drippiness of the mark making is all part of the work. And you find three color glazes all over Asia, in Japan and in Vietnam and in the Philippines and in all the countries over there over centuries and centuries. And I'm showing you an example with a different chromatic quality by George Orr from the 1890s. And then you find it all over Europe a bit later on in the Middle Ages, well, and so on. And whether, those colors were reinvented because, iron and chrome and copper and some cobalt are common color to put in a glaze and are found everywhere. Whether there was direct influences that wares from China came to the New World or is difficult to assess. But, humans are the same everywhere. They all have the same needs. They more or less engage in the same activities. They're interested in the same things. They more or less have the same material and eventually very similar technologies. So it's quite normal for things to appear to be more or less the same, although they're made at very, very different times in very different countries. It creates automatically quite a lot of similarities, I believe. And it's quite impossible to know whether there was direct influence or emulation or not. But what I want to bring up here is that in this dish from Nishapur, Iran, or this one from Italy, 5 centuries apart, there is a tremendous similarity in terms of patterns, the object itself, the making of the objects, its glazing, its firing, the color relationships. And I find that quite exciting, all those correspondence and connections and relationship that exist within the field of ceramics over time. And also it tells you the way the ware was stacked in a kiln. The one on the left has 3 little prongs, so it tells you that another one was stacked on top of it at some point. The one on the right, all the drips are in one direction, so that tells you that the ware was positioned strategically in the kiln, probably just to save time and make the stacking of the kiln a bit more efficient, but it creates a beautiful effect nonetheless. And I think people were aware of that when they were making the ware, and we're certainly very aware of it now as we look at it. And I hope that from now on, when you go to a museum or look at this type of ware in books or anywhere else, you will become aware of how they were glazed and fired and what happens in all those relationships that I am mentioning to you today. And then the way the glaze is applied as well can have a very strong influence on the final visual quality. This is sponge ware made by Wilton Wedgwood at the end of the 18th century, and the colors are applied over a single clear glaze, and the pigment is then applied with a sponge on top, and in the firing it becomes it colors the glaze basically. So other example of sponge wear and the movement of the glaze over the form and the blending of the color together, and all those qualities that are to a large degree specific to ceramics as an art form, and of which there are beautiful examples here. So the example of on the right, for example, references sunshine glazes, the three-colored glazes of the Tang Dynasty, but it was made under Emperor Kangxi at the very beginning of the 18th century, and it is a porcelain piece with overglazed enamel. So although the color are referentials to a type that's much older and made with a different material in a very different way, it's a completely new reinterpretation in a different material with a different process altogether. And ceramics is full of those kinds of things where, things that look like something else can be made at a completely different time with completely different material and completely different processes, yet to achieve similar aesthetic effects. And I quite like those egg and spinach dishes from the Kangxi period of China, which are again low-fired enamels over high-fired unglazed porcelain wares, imitating low-temperature earthenware wares of about a millennium before. And they did the same thing then in China as well, and then this was done in Japan. And it's quite interesting to see how those three colors, sunshine glazes, have this tremendous impact and history of the development of ceramics in England and in contemporary Japan, and artists like Kato Takuo again revisits the potentials for those colors, those glazes to create original and contemporarily relevant effects. And then in various folk potteries and domestic wares all over the world, the application and the effects of the runniness of glaze is explored in very beautiful way for all kinds of reasons. I will not go into mocha ware any more than showing you those two examples. If you are curious about mocha ware, just Google it, and there are books on it, and it will explain to you the material to use and how the application has to be specific and how you can achieve this characteristic effect if you are so curious about it. But as in the first lectures, my interest today is to introduce you to the potential of glazed surfaces in ceramics, making you aware of some specific examples. In the reading of the chapter, you will learn more about some of those things, and I hope it will raise your interest for you to be more curious about Oaxaca ware in Mexico and all of those possibilities that glazes have. And you will find information from this continuous research to develop your own work and develop a sophistication around your own work. So there are all kinds of ways to apply a glaze. You can mouth blow the decoration. You can use sprays, mechanical sprays, or all kinds of ways of applying sprays. And then there are all kinds of various glazes as well. And again, because of the great variety of glazes that were developed in Asia, most notably in China, I want to introduce some of them to you, like Onan black ware or Chun glazes, which are a very specific type of glazes. Yaozu ware, which is an early type of celadon, which is a characteristic green glaze. Another example of a beautiful Yaozu ware, Maiping vase on the right. And then you have examples of imperial porcelain from China, where each color was symbolic of a specific use and a specific person who was allowed to use that color for their needs within the emperor court. Dingware, which is a type of white ware with a very thin clear glaze, is very interesting. And you can see from the work of Edmond de Waal on the right how dingware has been something he has been aware of and served as an inspiration and influence in his work. And then you have copper red glazes, again, an invention of Asia and China that has traveled all over the world and is still very important in the context of contemporary ceramics. Crackle glazes. Glazes have a tendency to create defects and have accidents of all kinds, like the drip could be considered an accident or a defect even. But crackle glazes are also a defect of the glaze that creates a wonderful aesthetic effects. You can see on the right, the bottle shape was thrown on the wheel, and the throwing created a torque in the neck, and the crackle follows that torque as it cracks in the cooling of the glaze. So the Chinese were really the first also to use the defects and accidents of glazes for aesthetic purposes to create objects of great beauty and great sophistication. So my interest here is just to introduce you to some glaze surfaces and glaze possibilities. There are thousands more. And here you have a Ferrari with a crackled Celadon surface, which is a fake paint job imitating the surface of a crackled glaze on a porcelain Celadon object. Edmund Elton was a very eccentric potter working in England at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and he developed a large repertoire of very interesting, excessive, exaggerated glaze surfaces. So again, this is somebody who's known, whose name you should know. Luster glazes, also found in Asia, but in Europe as well at the turn of the 1900s. Clément Massier was one of the great master of luster glazes. Those are two more examples of his work here. They're glazes that are specifically made with certain material, applied in a certain way, and more importantly, fired in a very specific way. And then those luminescent, iridescent, very rich and deep colors and surfaces develop. And the Zsolnay factory in Hungary is probably the greatest maker of lusterware in Europe at that time. And the factory is still in operation and still making those types of ware today in Hungary. So the tradition is very much alive. In the contemporary world, Beatrice Wood, the American potter, working from the 1950s on, rediscovered for her own needs the luster glazes going back in time by millenniums by them, and developed very beautiful work. And then George Orr, the very avant-garde and inspirational potter who worked at the end of the 19th century in Biloxi, Mississippi, also invented very wonderful surfaces and worked with the defects of glaze and the accidents of glazes and so on. I just want a small intermede with salt glaze stoneware, because again, it's a very specific form of glazing where the stoneware pieces are put in the kiln without any glaze. And then at the end of the firing at maximum temperature, salt is introduced in the kiln, and the salt deposits on the stoneware glaze and becomes a glazed surface through the process of firing more than anything else. And those were invented in Germany in the early Renaissance and then developed all over the world, including in North America in the 19th century and so on. In pre-Columbian America, we only have one example of glazeware, and some of them are found in Guatemala and others in Colombia, in South America. And this happens at the very end of the pre-Columbian era, just before contact with Europeans. And of course, when the contact with Europeans happens, things change dramatically, and there are no examples before those late classic works of around 1450, 1500s. And then after that, through colonization, things change dramatically as well. But they're called plumbed pottery, because it's basically a mixture of ground lead with water that's brushed on the forms, and it creates a very thin coat of a glaze that shows you the beginning of that technology in the New World before the European came. So now I'm going to show you more examples of drips, because I've been making a case for drips since the beginning, and I want you to be aware of how the potential for drips is a great way to speak of process, speak of change and transformation, speaks of fluidity and fixity and all of those things. You have here a piece by Ron Nagel, who is a contemporary potter, where he's carved the drip within the clay so that it looks like a natural drip, but it's actually a fake drip that's artificially constructed. And then for a while, I'll just show you what I find to be very beautiful examples of drip surfaces and how historical folk pottery from time past, like this beautiful jar from Japan, serve as an inspiration for the work of Thomas Kutte from Germany, where he used the glaze application and the feel of the glaze to create an emotional state that I call the psychological drip on his large pieces. So there are many examples all over the world. This is just a small selection. Those two from Japan, from the village of Tamba, the other one from the village of Onda. And the Japanese, as we will see later on in the material aesthetic chapters, are great process makers. They are very in touch with material, very sensitive to how process affects the final outcome in terms of the application, in terms of the firing of the ware, and so on and so forth. And I wanted you to be aware of those things in the context of glazes and surfaces in ceramics in a variety of examples. So if you are curious about gray shino, you just go Google it and find out more. I've always been very attracted to the work of Nonomura Ninsei, a 17th century Japanese potter, and how he has combined the organic, messy, chaotic application of a drip of glaze that is fired at stoneware temperature, and then he went back with overglaze enamel and gold lusters and contested the organic quality of the messy drip with this very rigorous geometric pattern. And by the contrast of the two, a very dynamic and exciting beauty takes place. This is an example of an Ninsei where the glaze coming from Sanshai Tang Dynasty ware, if you remember from just a few minutes ago, the glaze here is not a drippy glaze. It has been applied to look like the movement of a glaze, but because it is faked, it has a stiltness and a frozen quality that is not as convincing as the other one. So again, so many different types of glazes all over the world, Shino being one of them. Oribe ware from Japan is also characteristic, the use of this green glaze, the application that's very strategic, the very sort of childish patterns that are combining to create this, symbiosis of contrast and contradictions that I find very beautiful. Now you will read in the essay for this chapter that drips can be a very dangerous thing to use as well. And in my opinion, they can be used very stupidly. And this is a mistake many people make. And if you use them well, it's extraordinary what happens. But if you use them badly, it can become quite dumb. And a few more examples are coming up of very beautiful and good examples of glaze surfaces, glaze applications, glaze qualities in the work of a number of artists whose name you should know, and you may want to research further. Those people were initiator of a lot of those kinds of modes of working and the development of very rich and excessive and extreme relationship between the glaze and the form and the behavior of the glaze on the form. And I think you should know who they are, and you should be curious about them, and you should develop your curiosity of them further. And a contemporary example by Yuting Jiang from Taiwan are those wonderfully glazed and drippy glazes that he is making in the contemporary world. And I'm showing you a very last image from the contemporary world by Hideaki Miyamura from Japan, which combines crystalline glazes, luster glazes, drippy glazes together to create a surface and a visual quality and an aesthetic experience that only exists within the field of ceramics and nowhere else to that degree of power and sophistication. Thank you.